Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Peacock. If you haven't already, please go to combatlearning.com/newsletter to get my Intro to Motor Learning for Martial Arts, a PDF I wrote so you can get up to speed on the powerful concepts we're discussing in the show. Plus, you'll never miss an episode. Go to combatlearning.com/newsletter. Today, I'm joined by Alan Dunton, a PhD in skill acquisition, human performance specialist, and a lecturer at TUDublin. He also has a background in ITF taekwondo. In this episode, we discuss a couple important studies done on self-organization and how to simulate a more realistic level of anxiety to competition. Then we discuss how the point system for sport taekwondo can be manipulated to aid constraints-led training for specific tactics without over-constraining learners. Finally, we clear up how to understand the difference between predictive and prospective control of movement, which is one of the key divides between information processing and ecological dynamics theories of motor control and learning. So if you're excited to jump in, hit the subscribe button on your podcatcher and enjoy the show.
If you could give us a background of like what it is you do, your academic background, the research you've done, and even a little bit of your background also in combat sports, that'd be awesome.
Cool. Now with the shoot away?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great, yeah. So I actually started my martial arts journey at about 4 years of age. I started doing taekwondo, fell in love with it really, and I kind of took over as my primary sport while I was doing about 4 or 5 others. And then when I kind of got to 15 or 16, I was after getting my black belt. I then started to represent Ireland on a kind of national and international basis, which was awesome. Got to travel to some great countries, Canada, Argentina, Sweden. Competed with Ireland until I was about 18 or 19, and then kind of ceased then. It wasn't really as good as I could have been to go in and compete at a senior level. But yeah, ever all the way through that journey, I kind of coached in my club and stuff like that. And that kind of gave me a real keen interest in sport as it was. So I did my undergrad in sport and exercise in CIT. And then from there, I went on to do a PhD in skill acquisition in the Cork Institute of Technology, which is now the Munster Technological University under Edward Collin and Cian O'Neill. And that kind of looked at visual attention and how we can guide it to look at improving particular skills. So I kind of started in basketball as my first study. We looked at, if I guide your visual attention upwards, can you continue to dribble the ball but maintain your gaze outwards or your visual attention outwards? So that was kind of the intro study that we kind of looked at, and then that transitioned into 2 football specific or soccer specific studies. So if I wear these pair of goggles that remove the side of the ball as it's coming towards me, can I attend my visual attention and my general attention to what's out in front of me? So where the game is hypothetically happening. So the first study we did on that, we looked at a really simple kind of number recall task. So a lot of numbers would appear on a projector, and you'd have to control and pass the ball either to your left or your right based on what was coming up on the screen. And then we kind of brought that into a more field-based approach where we looked at, again, if somebody passes me the ball and they run left or right, and then somebody passes me the ball and the teammate runs left or right and an opponent runs the opposite way, and then if I include somebody running towards me, can I pick up enough visual attention in the environment to control and pass the ball back to the most appropriate person while I'm under time pressure and while I have a multitude of things happening in the environment in front of me? So it's really about guiding visual attention out towards the environment more so I can make the most appropriate decision based on that change in visual information. So I'm no longer watching the ball come all the way to my foot. I'm starting to look at what's happening with teammates and opponents and then making a better decision based on that information. So that was awesome. Kind of the track of my PhD and how I went from young taekwondo student all the way through to there. So
Yeah, that's awesome. What style? Just for I know that some of the guys listening are gonna want to know like what style of taekwondo you did.
ITF, yeah.
ITF.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah,
So
that's the one.
I started as GTF and then went to ITF, and
Oh, okay.
it was
I'm pretty sure I have a friend in GTF, like an internet friend that I've corresponded with for a long time.
Mhm.
Is that more Kukiwan style? Like
there was
WT?
no like mainly discernible difference between GTF and ITF when I
Oh,
transitioned.
okay.
So they were very similar. And then you obviously have WTF, which is the Olympic based style, which is quite different to that kind of ITF and GTF style.
Yeah, that's what I do is the Olympic. But I started in a style that was kind of descendant from ITF. So that's kind of so when my first 5 years of Taekwondo, I was doing like the big broad stances and the different that kind of stuff, and the kicking with the like the round kick with the ball of the foot, it kind of curled, and that sort of style. So it's cool to have an eclectic background, but yeah, that's cool. I know the martial arts are nerds, so they're gonna want to know.
Absolutely,
I wonder what style of Taekwondo he did. So that's really cool. I guess the question I have off the top of my head, because you did research on actually not following the ball all the way to your foot so that you can keep your attention on what's going on in the environment. Would you say that has some application to combat sports? Because I know for me, especially with new students, because I used to be an instructor, like when they're sparring, I find some of the fighters will like follow the foot all the way until it hits them, and so their attention is totally stuck on the movement of the blocking, and then like watching the foot as it hits and moves, instead of being able to block and like maintain their attention on. So have you found that as well in your own practice? Or
yeah, absolutely. I had the joy of being able to go back and coach kind of kids when I was going through my PhD, and the PhD tool I used would be kind of classified as a modified perceptual training tool. So it's just a pair of goggles that remove the sight of kind of everything in your lower grade visual field. So in a combat sense, depending on how far away I am from the person across the way from me, I might not be able to see their feet or knees. And I actually brought them in and used them in training with some of our younger kids, because I think when you look at the traditional progressions for kids or beginners, you always kind of start with hand sparring, and then you move and introduce the feet a little bit more. And one of the funny things you always find is that kids will watch the hands and somebody will be punching.
Yep.
And they'll be focusing on that. And then if somebody starts kicking, they'll just stare at the feet. So as soon as they start staring at the feet, somebody's just going to pop them in the head with a little punch.
Yeah.
And then even beginners as well. So people who are a little bit more along the adult pathway will still really focus on not being hit by a kick. So they'll focus on really trying to watch the foot or watch the hand. Whereas a lot of the research, or even though it's kind of limited in combat sports and martial arts, kind of shows that the expert or more elite athletes just focus on the trunk and head, or the torso and head region, because that's going to give you a whole lot of information based on what somebody's doing from an attacking perspective. So I definitely have used the visual attention kind of guiding concept of where is important to look. So for like, I don't know, it depends if you're working with kids, I like to make it a much more enjoyable concept of maybe they'll be superhero fans. So I say, okay, well, watch the Iron Man chest, and they'll have this idea of an Iron Man chest in the middle. So it gives them something that they can really associate with. Yeah. And they love that kind of idea. Or else I'll tell people to draw a triangle between the belt and the center of the dobuck or something along the lines of that. So they're starting to get a bit more information in terms of, okay, well, I know if I'm watching this general region, not with like an intense focus, but a kind of a softer focus, I'll see more subtle movements in the hip, or I'll see more subtle movements in the torso as it rotates, either kick or punch. So that's kind of how I would introduce that into the combat setting on a kind of a nice basic level.
That's cool. I know that you might have seen this before, but a company called Dado and they're more big. They do stuff for sport karate too, but like they're more big for Olympic taekwondo. They licensed with Marvel Hogu, like chess gear, that is superhero based. So there is an Iron Man set that has it right
That's
there.
awesome, though.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And I know sometimes in ITF that they'll use chess gear too occasionally. So I mean, it could be something that you could use for the kids, even in an ITF style taekwondo.
I think it works really well. It just gives them that sense of a little bit more of a connection with what they're doing. It makes it a little bit more enjoyable. So
yeah, it's super cool. And it even has like matching like forearm guards and leg guards and stuff. Awesome. So it's pretty fun. I wish they had that stuff around when I was in taekwondo.
Yeah, me too.
I would have got the Spider-Man one. I wouldn't have got the Iron Man. So most of my listeners are gonna be familiar kind of with motor learning, broadly speaking, kind of like as acquiring and developing movements or refining movements. But as we've just kind of talked about, you've worked pretty specifically within an area, like within perception. So like I call it perceptual motor learning. I don't know if that's the proper term for it. So like what is perceptual motor learning, and how does it differ from like a very just, I guess, movement based approach to motor learning that a lot of practitioners, especially in martial arts, have?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of terms that people throw at it. Like you have perceptual cognitive skills, you have perceptual motor skills. You can keep it really simple and go with just perceptual skills. And if I kind of run through what I would kind of look at as perceptual skills, you've got things like gaze behavior that looks at things like where you fixate your visual attention and how long you fixate your visual attention for, be that in an attacking or a defensive perspective. You look at anticipation from a interception, or in combat sports, an evasion perspective. So can I anticipate an attack, or am I anticipating sequence of movements? You then have like your decision making, which layers really well with anticipation. And then you have things like pattern recognition, situational probability, that all kind of tie into that broader idea of what perceptual skills or what perceptual training may be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I mean, like there's been some really good frameworks put in place before. There's a framework done by Stephen Hadlow, who's in Australia, and it's the Modified Perceptual Training Framework. And I think it works really well for anybody who's trying to get their head around the idea of what is perceptual training and how do I go about starting to train it. You can look at this framework, and he has kind of 3 continuums that he puts elements of perceptual training on. He's got like the targeted perceptual function. So are you looking at kind of the basic visual stimulus, like a very low end stimulus, or are you looking at a stimulus that's, I can see it, but I'm not necessarily, but I'm trying to perceive what this actually means. So there's a significant difference between somebody who can see hip rotation and understand that this is a potential turning kick coming to the body or to the head, or are you looking at it on a lower order level of, I'm just seeing a hip move, but I don't know what that means yet. So that's kind of one of the ways you can look at it. You can then look at like the stimulus being very generic or very sport specific. So again, you kind of look at combat perspective. If I'm using very broad air shields that I don't move whatsoever, that's quite a generic stimulus. Or if I'm looking at like say numbers or letters, that's a generic stimulus versus somebody trying to attack with a combination of punches, which is your more sport specific one. And then you kind of can layer that to become more and more competition relevant with timing and with ring size and so on and so forth. And then the last one is that kind of response correspondence. So how are you getting somebody to actually respond in the perceptual training environment? So in academia, unfortunately, a lot of times it's been very heavy on the perceive only concept, where they'll just try and get people to say what they're seeing, which doesn't really satisfy what happens in sport, because it's that concept of act to perceive and perceive to act. In that sense, where you in combat sports, you're always moving, you're trying to gauge distance against your opponent. You look at, when you bring it into mixed martial arts, you have a multitude of things that somebody can throw at you, whereas you limit it back to some other martial arts like taekwondo. You know somebody's not going to try and take you down, so it changes the stimulus of how you act, one, but then also what you're trying to perceive based on that interaction of two people. And I think that's probably the most important element of perceptual training, is understanding that it's an interaction, and it's that perception action cycle is continuously evolving.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So you said that the academic has a problem with having you call out what it is you're perceiving. That would seem like it's that type of study is already biased towards an information processing theory, and it kind of rules out an ecological.
Yeah, I mean, it can be ecological in a sense, because they'll get people to maybe step to the side or else just verbally respond, but where it does lend itself a little bit more information processing, whereas I am definitely kind of on the other side of that spectrum. And I think the key issue I have with that is a lot of the studies that have been done in this is that the error of accuracy is quite large. So in, like, say, volleyball, or in tennis, or in any of those skills, people will indicate on, say, a visual of the pitch or the court where they felt like a serve would have gone. And there's still massive error even for experts. Whereas in a real life setting, that error is marked down as an error. Whereas in the studies that have been done, those verbal reports don't really give you an indication of how elite a person really is, or how they actually respond.
Okay, I gotcha.
So that's where that big disassociation comes for me. And like, it's one of those things that it's definitely getting a lot better, but it's one of those things that's really important to try and address, not only from an academic perspective, but keeping that in mind when you're doing the practical element of combat sports. If I am focusing on sparring drills and I only have one person who's really ever moving, and the other person is just kind of there to hold a pad, it creates a similar disconnect for me, because you're not actually having somebody respond to what they need to. There's a great video of a guy doing takedowns with dummies, and there's 3 dummies lined up, and he does his first takedown, and then he does the second takedown. But the last dummy is a person in a dummy costume.
Yeah.
And that person wraps around and just flips him on his back.
Yep.
And that highlights the kind of importance of that connection for me.
Yeah. And you just mentioned so I got myself in a lot of trouble for this. I say a lot, it wasn't that bad, but there's kind of tiers of awareness within martial arts right now. You have people that are totally traditional, that have absolutely no awareness of motor learning or motor control or how to do anything better. They just do what they were taught to do, and that's what they think works, right? And a lot of them really have no interest in moving beyond that. Then you have a second tier. You have your firebrand rebellious people who want to get rid of certain training methods, and they have kind of these reasons for it, but at the end of the day, yes, their training looks a little bit different, but it's still broadly traditional, and they don't understand why, for example, more sparring is better, or why pad work is good for them, but they don't want to do like a one-step sparring or something like that, right? And then they're kind of stuck in that box where they're kind of they're a little bit above the traditional level, but they're not looking at the theoretical, the things that underlie why something like sparring or something different than one-step sparring actually would be better than doing one-step sparring, right? And then you have a tier above that, which is people that are actually reading the research. They're looking at why it's important to spar, like trying to attune to information, for example. And then when you're looking at that and you think, oh, okay, the fidelity of the stimulus that's offered to you is actually important. So, for example, and this is where I got myself in some arguments on the internet, is when you're looking at, for example, mitt work for boxing, normally a cross or a straight right is offered as a sort of counter to a jab. But the way the mitts are set up, even if they're inside, the wrong shoulder moves, the wrong, you get the wrong, if you're attuned to this information here for boxing, the wrong shoulders moving to signal that, right?
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
you're practicing attuning to the wrong information. First of all, you're more focused on the mitts anyways.
Yeah.
So even if there's the aspect of maybe you're not even focused on the right area. So you're focused on the wrong area with the exercise, or you're focused on what the guy's saying, which has nothing to do with boxing. And then if you're not focused on that, then you're getting the wrong perceptual information from where you should be focused on, like the shoulder area. And I know, and I realize that it's the same thing for paddle work in Taekwondo. You don't want to kick after the hands or the arm. You're not supposed to be watching the opening and closing angle of the paddle. It also gives you a strange, more so even than pad work, the range is off.
Yeah.
Because now you're actually not, you're farther away because you're kicking the length at the length of the arm instead of towards the trunk. So there's all this misalignment of information that's happening with these drills. And I think you just touched on that. I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you think that's...
Yeah, there's a lot of gold in what you've just kind of talked through, and some really key important points that really need to be addressed. And I'll come back to a study in a minute by Maloney and colleagues, and it's one of the better studies I've seen done that kind of talks about what happens in competition and what happens in training. But before I kind of go to that point, I think you mentioned it earlier that people don't understand why they make a change but don't understand why. And for me, why you do something is far more important than what it actually is. So if it's what you're trying to get students to almost do. So are you working on the decision making? Are you working on them trying to tune to something? So why you do something is far more important than what you do, for me, a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But to address the paddle work kind of aspects, you are right. A lot of the pad work stuff is creating a kind of perception of the wrong cues that somebody would potentially look for. The other side of that is a lot of times we see this in elite sport. Like there's videos of Floyd Mayweather doing some of the most outrageous pad work and you'll ever see, and it's super fast and it's super impressive. Might have absolutely nothing to do with why he's one of the best boxers that has ever lived. Might have absolutely nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
The problem is there's really culturally resilient beliefs within sports that people believe that this is why I have to do the network because the best person in the world potentially does it. And that's the wrong reason to do something. So that comes back to the why you do it. If you're doing it because you saw somebody else do it, it's a problem. The other thing I would say is I don't have a massive issue with paddle work if you do it in a particular way. So I'll talk you through like how I would have used it before in a taekwondo sense. Whereas I'll start and I'll have people have no pads on whatsoever and they'll just do touch sparring. It's still very much me understanding that there's an element of perception action here that's constantly ongoing. The reason I'm going to do touch sparring is because we can't always just go at full kilter and constantly be at that maximum 100% intensity, 10 out of 10 relevance, 10 out of 10 context, because it's super hard to train at that intensity the whole time. So I have no problem with reining it down from that perspective.
Yeah.
Then you can introduce paddles, but I think if you're going to introduce paddles, it very much has to be almost a simulation of sparring where you may be honing in on something in particular. If you want to work on turning kicks to the head, or you want to work on spinning back kicks, you can introduce paddles so that the person who's holding the paddle has something safe to be hit on that's not their body. But you want to try and keep it as close to the actual movements that somebody's going to be exposed to in a competition setting. And if you're going to do something along the lines of that for me is only a small portion of what you do, like a really small portion of what you do. And then it's integrated into actual combat or actual sparring.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably one of the biggest problems. It's not that I'm going to throw out everything that's ever been done before, but I'm just going to use it for something in particular. And I'm going to use it in a small aspect. And then I'm going to integrate it in to that broader, more open perception action coupling cycle of sparring, where I've got a much more representative training session.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So it can be quite dangerous because people see it and they think, oh, this is all I'm going to do. And I'm going to spend 90% of my time doing pad work, rather than actually, no, I'm just going to spend 5% of my time doing pad work, because it's a bit safer, and we're going to protect our athletes a little bit. And then I'm going to integrate what I'm doing there in line with everything else I've been doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's a lot of things you can do. And I know boxing has a really hard problem with this, but with Taekwondo, most of what you do is oriented towards the trunk, so it's safe to practice. But there are head kicks, and it's difficult to practice that sort of stuff in a representative environment. And paddles, if you do it the way you're supposed to do it, in the way they train it for like high level Olympic athletes, if you drop the paddle over this way and hold it next to your head and axe kick it there, that's a safe way to practice something in an almost representative sort of way. But if you hold it out like this, and a lot of people do that, they hold it way out in front. That's not, that's less useful. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is one of the other kind of big elements of why the pad work might be okay if you're looking to improve something called action capabilities. So say I'm struggling with my axe kick, or I'm struggling with a turning kick, and I, as an athlete, am trying to work on it in a representative environment, but one that's not as challenging. So if you have an athlete who's never going to throw an axe kick in a sport, because anytime they try it, they get smashed, you're going to reduce the tendency of them to explore an axe kick in that setting. So you can create that little bit more of a safer environment with the pad work that we're just kind of talking about. And then you can incentivize an axe kick in a much more representative environment where you're like, look, you can do this as a technique. Now I want you to really try and use it in a spar. And I'm going to give you an additional 2 points every time you score with an axe kick. So you're now incentivizing that axe kick that little bit more. So someone's going to start to push to actually be like, actually, you know what? I am going to try my axe kick now in this situation.
Yeah.
So for me, it's not about removing everything else from it. It's about incentivizing something to be. It's kind of what I think Danny Newcomb, I'm going to rob
incentivizing.
He calls it turning up the volume on a particular aspect.
Yeah.
So if I've got my range of kicks here and I want to focus, or I have an athlete who wants to focus on spinning kicks or wants to focus on a side kick, I'm just going to turn the volume up on that particular kick in that session. And I'm going to incentivize it by giving you additional points on that. Yeah. When you're in a sparring setting.
Yeah. I just made a connection there that I hadn't made before. So specifically in the Olympic sparring community, there's a lot of people that came out of like the 90s, 2000, before the electric Hogu, where Olympic Taekwondo looked quite a bit different. It was a lot more dynamic. There was a lot more, it looked different. It looked more powerful. I doubt that it was actually more powerful, but that's another thing. But it looked more powerful, and that's what people kind of want to get back to. And a lot of people don't like the aesthetic of the way it looks now, because of the way the electric Hogu and the change in the rules has changed the meta of the game. There's a sense in which the Olympic community understands how the rules change the way Taekwondo is done. So there's a sense in which they're already thinking on that level. But even me, who reads about the constraints-led approach and was even yesterday reading about the modified perceptual training thing out of the second edition of Dynamics of Skill Acquisition, I didn't even think about the fact that people are already thinking on that level now. Why don't we just take the way they think about competition and move that down to the way they train? So, okay, cool. You guys want to do, your guys aren't doing enough axe kicks. I won't say enough axe kicks, but you're not seeing axe kicks. This is a potentially useful and somewhat uncommon on a local level competition technique that your guys could be doing, but they're not doing it because the way you train doesn't incentivize it to emerge at any point. So adjust the points, right? I didn't even think about that. You could spar and adjust the point structure to incentivize what shows up more without outright cutting out other options.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because when I started to try and encourage kind of a broader range of techniques for fighters, because the more techniques you can throw from a kind of stand-up fight, the more you can hit your opponent with, and the more your opponent's going to find it very difficult to adapt to what they're seeing. So if I'm coming out and in ITF, and it was very psychic heavy, very side on, very psychic heavy. Everybody's throwing psychics. Yeah. So I was trying to identify, okay, well, how do we get our athletes to not be just a psychic heavy athlete? So I started by just saying, okay, we're just going to do sparring now. You can only throw axe kicks and you can only throw tourniquet kicks now. And it didn't really work. And I was like, maybe that's not the way to do it. So then I was about just turning the volume up on those, because the other person knows that all you're going to throw is an axe kick. So they're going to try and just anticipate that and move, because it's very difficult to catch somebody with an axe kick if they know you're going to throw an axe kick. So it's just about trying to encourage it in a more incentivized way, then remove all the other options. So I just want to turn the volume up here, to see what I want to manipulate in the training session.
That is exactly been my journey and my understanding of the constraints-led approach. You know, when I first came into contact with it, that it clicked, and I was like, wow, this is I never thought about it this way before, and this could be really awesome. But my initial understanding of it was, okay, we're just going to do jabs today. That's what we're going to do. We're going to make it alive, but it's just jabs, and you have to use your jab. And that was my understanding of constraints-led approach. But then as I read more into like ecological, the more broader ecological dynamics aspect of it, and the idea of how control, how control functions within that sort of environment, or under that sort of understanding, I started to wonder, like, well, hold on a second. If I want someone's own style of play to emerge, if I don't want to stifle any sort of any sort of exploration, I can't just wholesale remove techniques and 100%. Zero down into like one thing. So now I have to figure out how to focus on something without, and then what you're talking about with dialing, like that's, for me, that's a big deal, because you already have within a point sparring context a sort of meta representative element that if you play with the points now, you already have a toolbox to help with that constraints-led approach to understand how to approach design of your exercises. So that's awesome. I appreciate that you really just helped me there with connecting a lot of different dots that I've been thinking about. Now there's a line between them all. Awesome.
But there's a lot you can manipulate, though. I mean, I won't wholesale apply constraint to a group of athletes. I'll very much individually apply constraints depending on what somebody may potentially need. And so if you have an athlete who struggles to come offline against somebody who's attacking quite directly, I'll manipulate them to only being allowed to move laterally across the center of the ring. So their opponent's allowed to circle as much as they want. They have the full ring to use. But the person who's constrained can only move left and right. And that typically means that they've got to step offline anytime they want to counterattack. Now, I'm reducing an awful lot that they can potentially do. I'm not taking any techniques away from them, but I'm encouraging them to have to step off the line. I won't tell them that's what they're doing, but that's what I'll do. If I have athletes who almost try and run too much and end up not engaging in much of a spar, I'll stick them in the channel. So you're back and forward. You guys have to work within 1 meter. So you're heightening that very much aggressive, straight line, offensive attack rather than a counterattack. So you can manipulate in those aspects, and you can manipulate things like your timing. Okay, you've got 30 seconds left. How do your athletes respond in that? And I think a lot of that comes back to that paper I was talking about earlier, from Mike Maloney and colleagues over in Australia as well, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And they did a really nice study where they compared training to the competition environment. And what they saw was that, like, in training, the number of attacks that people engaged in was significantly less than in the competition. They saw that the kind of distance that they started to engage in an attack from was much further away. So you're, again, perceptually, you're not attuning to the same things in training that you would be in a competition sense.
Yeah.
They saw that predictable movements increased massively. Anxiety and arousal and mental effort were all significantly decreased. And it's not anxiety in a bad way, but it's that competition anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're looking at kind of your more elite athletes, those are the things you need to consider. And those are things you can start to apply some constraints to see how they actually engage in that setting and how well they can cope with those settings. So if you look at three kind of key things, and I, again, another stolen concept from my former PhD supervisor, Dr. Edward Collin, is you have context, relevance, and consequence are the kind of three key pillars that if you can have those in your training session, you're going to start to get your athletes closer to that. So context is it representative of the actual competition? And that could be in terms of constraining distances that your athletes can attack this. You have to work on a much smaller ring. So you're going to engage in attacks from that shorter distance rather than from that further away distance that they were seeing in the manipulation. You could start to manipulate, okay, we're going to have a 2-minute round. You have to attack at least 10 times offensively rather than counterattack in the session. If you get to that, you win the round. You may want to heighten spin kicks. So it's a spin to win game where if you score with a spinning kick, then you win at the end of the 2 minutes if the other person hasn't scored with a spinning kick, no matter what the other scores. You might have just scored a spinning kick. They might have hit you with 7 or 8 side kicks, but because you were in that incentivized range, you were able to win that particular round. And then you have consequence, which is kind of one of the biggest changes I've ever, one of the biggest light bulb moments I've ever had in training. And that's if I apply consequences, and consequences as a term is a bit of a funny one, to my athletes, I can manipulate how their arousal and anxiety levels vary in training.
Okay.
Now, those words can be quite standoffish for a lot of people, but when I say consequence, it can be something really simple like, if I have an athlete who absolutely despises being the one who chooses music in a gym session or in a warm-up, then I'll apply that as a consequence to them. And it's funny, it's the moment that players go, I don't want to do that. Or you say, okay, well, if you lose, you've got to clean your opponent's gear, because we all know that the gear is absolutely horrific in terms of the gear bags and the smell of it. Or if you're in a club, if you're in a club where the mats come up and go down at the start and end of every session, half of your group who lose their spar may be the ones that have to take the mats up, because nobody enjoys taking the mats up at the end of the session. Oh, that's
miserable. I've done that before. Exactly. It's miserable, yeah.
So if you apply consequences like that, you've just created a lot more value to that spar. So somebody's going to be far more likely to engage to try and win the spar than they might have if there was no consequence whatsoever. So your arousal levels are coming up. And as a result, there's a little bit more anxiety because you don't want to lose that spar, because you don't want to have to do the consequence. Now, I think it's really important to point out that a consequence isn't a punishment in terms of like a physical task, because I think that's probably one of the sides of things that I really kind of dislike when people start applying consequences. Like, oh, you're going to do press ups, so you're going to run an extra mile, because the punishment aspect is not something. It's the more fun element of a consequence that works really well.
There's like a long, and I wrote like an article just trying to get my thoughts out a few years ago on this. There's a long and very toxic history of using consequences, or really punishments like push-ups and burpees and things like that, to disincentivize people from exploring and trying things out in practice. So if you're doing your jungbang, which is what we called the bow when I was doing taekwondo many years ago, if you drop that, you had to do 10 push-ups.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't go as fast. I wouldn't try different ways to spin it. I wouldn't try, I would stick to what I knew, and I would go at the pace I was at. And that's what I did for 10 minutes. And that's all I got out of practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the really important part of that. If you're adding consequence, it's got to be something that's more of a fun consequence in a way. Especially if you're dealing with younger kids, it can't be punishment, because as you so rightly pointed out, the exploration is just minimized straight away.
Yeah.
They go back into like the safest zone they possibly can. They're not going to try anything. And typically, I would only start looking at applying consequences with older athletes who are at a more elite level. But it's just one of those things that gets you closer to the competition style of sparring than what typically may occur in training. And again, this isn't for every training session, but we can't expect athletes to perform at a competition level if they've never been exposed to those sensations outside of it.
Yeah. So I'm thinking in my head as you're saying this, if I were trying to differentiate the difference between the improper or toxic use of consequences versus its proper place where it's actually useful, and I would say that when you want to train the affective with an A, the affective aspect of a competition, you can add consequences, like you said, to. That was exactly the question I was going to ask you about that study after I had read it, was how do you simulate this? And that's awesome. So if you want to simulate that anxiety level without actually being in a tournament, that's a way to do it. If you want to practice the effective parts of training, like actually exploring, trying out functional movement patterns, functional solutions to problems, then you don't want to be using those consequences, because you want people to explore.
Yeah. I mean, you can, and that's the thing, you can have training sessions where the aim is exploration. And if you are the person who tried to explore the least amount of ways, the consequence could be applied to you. I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest things as well, is it's important that your athletes get it wrong. It's important that they fail. And it's important that, because if, and it's one of the things I always used to find quite funny about martial arts in the traditional sense, is it had to look a particular way, and and if it didn't, it was an error and it was seen as a bad thing. And the kind of, some of the kids who I trained with who were a little bit unorthodox in their fighting style, who were actually still really good fighters.
Yep.
But because they didn't look how they were supposed to look, we're told that, no, you need to change this, you need to change this, and you need to change this, because it needs to look a particular way.
Yeah.
We're always almost told that what they were doing was wrong, rather than being kind of congratulated for their exploring and their ability to come up with a novel way to throw technique. And I think that's in martial arts, that traditional view of what the technique should be can hamper an awful lot of that creativity and exploration.
It's like the Moneyball effect, where you get people from a weird background that do things a little bit funkier, but if you actually look at their stats, they're good, even though they don't look the part of what is established as the correct formal way to do it. That's why when I talk to, it's so different, the changes in categories between motor learning research and skill acquisition versus the categories, this sort of artifice of categories that traditional martial arts have built up around it. You have to translate between the two to even have a conversation. And it's so difficult. And it's like, so what I say, the sort of, I guess, nomenclature that I use is like formally correct versus functional. Whereas you have the way that a technique looks, it's sort of kinematic aesthetic, I guess you could say. And we have these established markers for the way it's supposed to look like. Which is great for sport, Pumse, right? In a situation where you want to judge people based on the way it looks from a standard. But in a situation that is outcome dependent, like sparring, where you have to get points, you have separate metrics, like EHOGUs have a pressure threshold that you have to, you have a part of the limb that you have to use to break that threshold to score. So it's based on scoring, and it's based on how fast can you be while still hitting that power threshold on the EHOGU, which changes the dynamic of the game. The kicks look different. The strategies look different, but the outcomes are a certain way. If you want to have training that's oriented towards sparring, then you have to stop thinking about the formally correct technique and thinking about what works.
Yeah, but even that comes back to that original kind of question you asked me in terms of what is perceptual skill, what are perceptual skills, or what is perceptual motor. Postural cues are one of the key things that feed into that. So if you were to look at it from a kind of a triangle perspective, you have the player, the opponent, you have the situation, and then you have the task. So when you kind of dig deeper into those, if you look at the situation, the postural cues that you're trying to pick up have a big impact on your ability to either defend, or if you're in an attacking perspective, if somebody can't pick up on the postural cues or the lack of postural cues you're giving, you've got a much better chance of scoring. So it's one of those things, is what is the requirement? And as an athlete, or as somebody who's trained to develop athletes, can you get them to a place where they're exploring their own unique way of doing that, rather than this is the textbook, this is what we follow, this is how you do it, this is the way you do it, and there's no other option. So that's one of those key things in terms of perceptual training, is if I can, one, be exposed in my typical training group to a lot of different perceptual cues, I'm going to start to become a lot better at identifying the ones that are a little bit unique. So if I come up against it in a competition setting, I'm problem solving while I'm in competition, and I'm able to adapt to that unique style. Whereas if I'm in a club where everybody kicks the same way, and I go into a competition setting and somebody kicks differently, I've never been exposed to those varying postural cues, and I'm going to find that very difficult to adapt.
Yeah. That's awesome. This is going to be really, really great for the coaches that listen to my podcast. And I know that a personal friend of mine that is doing really well and having some success with the constraints-led approach with Olympic Taekwondo athletes, understanding how not just being able to explore functional movement solutions, that's like one layer of and a really important layer of representativeness, but you also have that anxiety level and the other affective aspects of that. If that's not present, then you're not, the level of representativeness of your training is lacking. And I had another connection that I made there in the different combat sport. There was recently a documentary out of flow wrestling or flow rolling or whatever, where there's a team. It's called Pedigo submission fighting, and it's a whole quirky thing. It has its own weird kind of vibe to it, because it's just a bunch of dudes, young guys that don't work. They're not dumb, like they're smart people, but they don't work. They just train full time. They used to live inside of the gym. The gym is like an old rundown laundromat called Daisy Fresh, and they didn't have enough money to change it to Pedigo submission fighting. So now they're the Daisy Fresh crew, right? That's what they are. They have shirts with the old logo for the laundromat, and it's really funny. But these guys are killing the competition scene, especially the professional submission fighting scene. And the guy that runs it is pretty intelligent. He does a lot of different like positional sparring type of interesting methods, but one of the things that they do, and this is not sustainable, right? You can't actually really train this way, but one of the things that they do is they train at a volume, at an intensity that is like 90 to 100% all the time.
Mm.
And most other jiu-jitsu athletes, I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but most jiu-jitsu athletes, if you go in and you roll, it's just a fun time, right? And you don't do anything serious until competition time. So you never get that anxiety level, that affective dimension of representativeness for the actual performance environment. And I think that's one of the reasons these guys are just kind of doing the same techniques everyone else is doing, but they're killing it in competition because they've been training in an environment that's more representative of the intensity and the anxiety of actual competition. Because you'll have to listen to him talk in the documentary, and he's like, yeah, dude, I love training, but I hate training. Like, because you always have to be super sharp. These guys will injure you and they're friends, but they will injure you if you're slacking, if you're not 100%, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get, submitted. And these guys are killing competition, but they're also like, their injury level is accelerated, right?
Yeah.
They got slip discs and fingers that are bent the wrong way. And like, they're killing it in competition, but they're very quickly beginning to wear down.
Yeah. And that's really interesting. One for the list of things to watch, which at times grows ever longer, but it just resonated with me, something that, again, I'm gonna stick with my pattern of stealing things from other people and I'm
a stealer.
Yeah. And it's Mark Sullivan who does work with youth development, but he speaks about the concept of as many as possible, as long as possible, for as good as possible. But it's very much something you could apply to these guys. There may be a view of them killing it in competition, but he's given the example before of, if I put 6 eggs in a basket or in a bag and I chuck that bag against the wall and I take 1 egg out that survived and say, look, my process worked. But nobody pays any attention to the 5 broken eggs on the floor. You could take the same concept and look at it from 1 or 2 of these guys may be winning a competition, but there may be another 4, 5, 6 at home with a slip disc or with so many injuries that they may never be able to compete again. And the longevity of that, it just doesn't seem viable, especially in terms of the longevity of the same people doing it. Long term, they may just have people who see that, oh, that worked for that person, they won, I'm going to try it that way. And you may just have a consistent turnover. But from an ethical perspective, where do you stand on having people who come into your sport or into your dojo or your Daisy Fresh laundromat or whatever it may be, versus how many do you lose? And that's the other side of it. You need to be, from an ethical perspective in sport, you need to be about not just what the people are when they're people first, they're athletes later. So you have to be cognizant of the person, and that's the other side of that coin. But
they call it the Daisy Fresh method. They actually do seminars of it now, where it's just basically they do some of the real cool, interesting methods, but it's mostly based around getting more rounds of high intensity rolling. And the people that have done it themselves, they've said, I feel like I'm way better. I'm having breakthroughs. But me looking at that, I'm like, that's great, and you should do that, but it should be like more like periodized. It should be more like maybe once a month, maybe once every other month, like not every practice, because you will get injured and you're going to get broken fingers, and you're going to have people who are programmers that aren't going to want to train anymore because it's too painful to do their job. And because of the grip stripping is at level 100%. And it's interesting that so many things you have to think about as a coach, of different dimensions of how to actually represent the environment and train people, not just to recognize and produce the correct response, but also like what's going on with managing anxiety and understanding, things that can lead to that. But, you sent me a lot of awesome studies before we were discussing. So we've kind of discussed, I think, 2 of the Taekwondo studies that you sent me. There's also a boxing study that I found really interesting, where it talks about how the environment can in part dictate the available actions a boxer can use at any given moment within a match. So it shows that to me, from my understanding, it shows that if you're at a point where you know boxing well enough, you tend to naturally self-organize in sort of specific ways in order to exploit affordances that present themselves throughout a boxing match. So, for example, if you're at a certain distance, there's a certain set of punches that are more likely to be used by a boxer who has a level of practice. Than if at a different distance where whether you're closer or farther away, fewer or more punching options are, even if it's technically possible to throw a punch from that range, the likelihood that it will emerge or that a athlete will choose to use that technique is much lower or higher. Can you talk to us about this sort of spontaneous emergence of functional tactics and strategies and how we can approach practice to help facilitate this?
Yeah, so that is a really interesting paper. I think it's Christofsky. I probably butchered that name.
I don't remember. I just remember the content.
Yeah.
I don't remember the names.
Keith Davis is on it as well, and that's always a good name down in there.
Yep.
But they look at it. It's kind of a concept of metastability. So we have like metastable regions, and you described it really well. If I'm talking about metastable regions, I'm like, what does a particular distance afford me? So if you want to take that to sparring in taekwondo, or you want to take the mixed martial arts, in the mixed martial arts perspective, I am going to be, and it's very much dependent on an individual's capabilities to perform a particular action. So if I'm very explosive at takedowns, I may be able to engage in a takedown from a further distance than somebody else, but that's my particular metastable region. But if you want to look at how you exploit that, and it comes back to constraints, if I can constrain the distance between opponents, I can start to perturb the system in terms of, okay, I'm going to go back to voluming up on a particular set of techniques where I'm going to incentivize those techniques, but from a particular distance that maybe they're not used to throwing them from. So how does an athlete explore to do something in a region that they typically don't engage in that particular technique from? I think a good example of it is probably a question mark kick, where you may be at a distance that's much more, that affords a front kick much more than a turning kick. But if you can build into that, okay, I'm going to show you a front kick, but I'm going to end up whipping that around into a question mark kick, hit you in the head with a turning kick, you can encourage exploration in those kind of metastable regions. So if I put you in a region that is uncomfortable for you, how do you adapt to that? And the reason I sent you that paper, and the reason I think it's really interesting, is I've been in the situation before as a fighter where I can't figure out the range of somebody else, and I'm getting kicked in the head and I'm getting blitzed and I'm like, I can't figure out this distance.
Yep.
So if, again, and that's in a competition setting, so I want to take that into the training setting to say, I'm going to put you in very unstable kind of regions or distances. So I'm going to start to work on you gauging distance and kind of getting much better at pattern recognition from that perceptual training perspective in these particular regions. And I'm going to see how you adapt to those. Okay. And again, this is one of those sessions where you feel probably terrible going home because you're like, I could not score a point and I got beaten around the place. But it's about then just encouraging somebody to start to adapt. And that's very much not a one training session thing. That has to be part of the culture of your club in terms of it's okay to make errors here. But then I can also start to get you to understand, oh, well, actually, I've never thrown this kick from this region, from this kind of distance. But actually, you know what? It actually works. So this is something I can start to do now. And then I can get people to understand what they can throw from those particular ranges and those particular distances. And it works quite well. And I've used this before in a training session, and sometimes the students get super confused. They have no idea why they're doing what we're doing. And I very much try to talk as little as possible. I will try and say as little as possible when I'm going through these things. So I'm like, I want you guys to try and figure this out. And if they need help, then I'll start to just probe with some questions Like, okay, well, tell me, what could you have done in this situation? You threw this technique from here 4 times in that last bar, but why did you not connect? Why do you think you didn't connect? And then they'll start to come along with you and they say, okay, well, maybe I need to try this. Okay, well, let's go back in. Let's see how that works. And you're then just kind of guiding that exploration and discovery rather than saying, from this distance, this is what you throw. From this distance, this is what you throw.
Yeah, instead of telling them,
so when you go back in, and this is all in the thought process of when I go back into competition, I want adaptable performers, people who can figure out what is happening in front of them, especially if they've never seen it before. So I just want problem solvers. I want to create problem solvers. So that's why I put them in those situations where they have to problem solve.
Yeah. What would you think of? This is a problem that I'm thinking about right now, because I've been thinking of not just as a practitioner, but of if I wanted to be a politician of sorts and I wanted to get into like a state level development of sport taekwondo, and I wanted to help guide and incentivize certain ways of training and developing within my state. It's difficult. Everyone does everything differently, and in one way that's awesome. In another way, everyone's just doing traditional training methods, right? So, I was thinking of a way of practicing where, you said like metastable ranges. Like, are there a finite grouping of metastable ranges, number one, within Taekwondo that I can define within some sort of taxonomy? And then can I use certain metrics within those ranges to measure a athlete's progress across those ranges to understand where they need work and what can be done to improve in their game there?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to look at that, you definitely have to get into the point of really analyzing your athletes that you'd be working with. Because as I said, the individual difference in athletes has a big impact on this. So if I've got 2 6 foot tall athletes, but one has got a much longer reach with their lower limbs than the other, or one has a much larger reach with their upper limbs, that distance is then different for both of those individuals. So it takes an awful lot of work. It's not like a blanket region by region, but you'll have kind of intra-individual regions that you could potentially map. So if you're working with an individual who has a great reach with their jab, and for them that this is how far they can reach, and this is how well they close distance with that jab, or how well they keep somebody at range with that jab, you can then set that up as, okay, well, this is it. Or you have somebody who's in a similar setting who has a similar arm length, but struggles to keep somebody at range with the jab. You can say, well, let's start to figure out the distance. And you can know, but I probably wouldn't encourage telling them that it's this distance, because you're just going to have them in their head about how far away they need to stand from someone. Right. And you can make the ring size to maybe encourage that. Yeah. And then you can analyze it, and then you can start feeding back in again. But the feedback in for me then is in those questioning states of, from a practical perspective, how that works. But you can have plenty of data at time to identify, well, actually they have improved on their jab within this distance based on their arm length. Yeah. So you can start to see if they throw a particular volume or percentage of jabs once they're in that particular range versus what they used to throw. And if they're starting to get a lot more comfortable with throwing that jab.
Yeah. I had an idea, and I'm just bouncing this off you. So this is this is not something I've written a paper on or anything like that. I'm just trying to figure out. I'm always worried about when you offer information constraints, there's a few things, and I've noticed this in my own practice, because I forget the rules of an engagement for like positional sparring or technical sparring. And I'm thinking of, how can I bypass the like cognitive problem of trying to remember certain rules during training, so that I actually my movement genuinely organizes along those lines, or my students. And if you want to get people to practice closer to each other, it's easy to attach a cord between their belts or something, right? And then they don't have to think too much about whether or not they're getting too far away, because they have they have sort of a kinesthetic index on that, and they don't have to think about it too much, right? And so they don't get to where they're I have to keep cueing them to stay closer, right?
Yeah.
You could also, like you said, make the ring size smaller.
Yeah.
But if you wanted them to stay in a range that's farther apart, I was thinking maybe something that you could do is you could have concentric rings, and then they have different colors. And then if you want them to stay within a range that's a little bit farther, you could say you can move between, the white ring and the blue ring, but do not go in farther than the yellow ring, right? And so you have to stay at a little bit of a longer range.
Yeah, you have to engage your attack before you enter a particular zone.
Right, but you can still move between some outer rings.
Yeah, so you just can't engage in an attack in that zone. So you can move in and out of it all you want, but you can't engage in your attack from within it. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, it would be weird. It would be super hard. There's all kind of different cool things you can do with the ring, but like actually building things that have all this stuff would be expensive and difficult, and probably super busy.
I think keeping it simple is one of the better ways to do it. Like in with the mats that flip, and you have two different colors on the same mat, those work really well. So we had those red on one side, blue on the other, so we could just get creative with the mat and the ring layout. If you have in your head that this is what you're going to do, you can create a big ring and a little ring. You can just get people manipulating between those and see how they adapt within both of those rings without really saying anything at all.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Another idea I had was to actually build. It's shaped like a Olympic taekwondo ring, which is more like an octagon now, but to keep people from like constantly going out of bounds. Like if you make the ring smaller so that they work more in a range that's representative of how people fight in. Because there's a paper, and it might have been self-same paper, but I think it was a different paper, where what they actually found was in sparring, they tend to kind of hang around at a farther range, and it's a little bit, there's less intensity. The motivation and the drive to get points is a little bit lower, but as opposed to being in a tournament, they actually, because they're more interested in points, there's that anxiety level where they really have a higher drive to get those points because they want to win. They instinctively spar or fight at a closer range. And I was, me just trying to figure out how do I simulate something like that. And this is before I really was understanding the anxiety aspect of it. But I was like, how can I simulate that with the environment? And I was thinking, without them always going out of bounds and having to constantly remind them, like, what if I made something more like a boxing ring that was shaped like that, where there's actually a physical barrier that you will hit, and you don't want to hit it, so your body will self-organize not to hit it, right? Mm-hmm. So could I build something like that to use that I can adjust the size of, to bypass constantly having to try and remind them to stay in this range.
Yeah. Well, I think a really simple way to do that was potentially have the other students stand at the distance, because now you have a bunch of students standing watching one spar, so the anxiety level is already increased from that perspective. Yeah. But you don't want to go falling into other students either. You don't want to. You don't want to be the one who's pushed out. So if you create almost that little bit more of a competition ring with Jesus, there's a lot of people really close watching me now, you're going to see those consequences start to, or those representative kind of intensities increase, because somebody's going to be like, I have 18 people standing very close to me who are all watching this spar very closely.
What's funny about that? Because sometimes I'm just too much in my head. One of my buddy who actually just coaches a lot more than I do, that was his solution. That's what he did. Yeah. I was like, this is why we need more than just one person thinking about this. Yeah. That's what he did. That was his solution, was to get them moved in. Yeah, because you don't want to hit your buddies, and then it's also a physical barrier there, and then they're watching too. So there's that elevated anxiety level. Yeah. That's great. And I know he listens to the podcast, so he's gonna. he's going to hear that. He'll like that. But okay, so switching gears to this karate study on situational information for decision making. This is getting into an area that I don't super understand that well yet. So it's like this one seems to be a big deal for like motor control, engaged behavior, and the paper. From my understanding of the paper is that they found that experts didn't look in as many different places as novices did when they're like scanning to find the information they need. Yet they were able to more quickly pick up and launch counters to certain patterns of attack. Can you explain what's going on here?
Yeah. So I think the situational probability aspect of it kind of ties into what kinematic information you're picking up from your opponent, or if you're down in a fight and you've got 30 seconds left, it's going to significantly impact your approach, because if you lose, you're knocked out. From a kinematic perspective, it's almost like a game of poker where people have tells, and those tells feed information into you in terms of identifying what's coming next. So I think what was really interesting about that study is they had designed it so that every 4 techniques, the same technique was repeated, and they got the novice and the elites to try and identify what attack was coming towards them. And the elites started to pick up on that probability much quicker. So they were able to identify the things that the other person was doing. That was able to give them enough information to say, okay, well, I know this is the turning kick. And I think to give you a really easy example of this, if you look at any novice or a beginner or somebody who's an intermediate who's about to throw a spin kick, their back leg is going to start creeping out behind them a lot earlier than somebody who's at an expert level who's going to throw it from their comfortable stance.
Yeah.
So the situational probability from that perspective is you're giving me kinematic information from your body that I'm able to say, okay, well, I know you're going to throw a spin kick because I can see you're priming your body to throw that, because somebody may not be very comfortable to throw it from that neutral stance.
Yeah.
And that gets a lot more difficult at an elite level. So you start to look at things like the timing, the score, and a couple of other factors that'll impact on whether somebody has to really press in that situation or whether they can disengage and just fight in a little bit of a smarter aspect. So if I am 2 points up with 10 seconds to go, I have no intention of engaging in the next 10 seconds. If I can avoid, I'm just going to move around. So from a situational perspective, depending on what side you're on, you know that there's something in particular coming. You know you're either going to get pressed and attacked, or you know that the other person isn't really going to engage, so you're going to have to be the one that engages. So if you want to start to set that up from a training perspective, you can start to apply the context of those elements, or those situational elements, into your training. From a kinematics perspective, I may come over to one of the 2 people sparring and say, okay, every 4 techniques, I don't care what you do with the first 3, but every 4th one, I want you to throw a turning kick, or every 4th one, I want you to throw a spin kick. And you start to see if the person on the other side is able to identify that. And then afterwards you say, okay, what was his, what kick did he use most frequently out of all of those? And if they're able to identify that, you say, okay, they might not be able to tell you what they were seeing, but if they're starting to see them and recognize them earlier, that situation probability in terms of the kinematics is starting to build in that person. So they're starting to perceive those cues a lot more. And then in terms of a timing perspective or a score perspective, it's kind of those typical things of you're 2 down with 10 seconds to go. What do you do in the situation? So if you train that in a training perspective and a competition perspective, it gives that person a sense of, I've been in this situation before. I can now start to develop upon that. So it's about bringing, and it's again about trying to close the distance between what happens in training and what happens in the competition. And exposing your athletes to that. And if you're not exposing them to that, it's that expectation of they don't understand what to do in those situations because they've never been in those before.
Awesome. So there's something that I've wondered. I have a couple questions on this. So one of them is Dr. Rob Gray was talking about, he was talking about the differences between prediction and prospective control.
Yeah.
And I must admit that I don't really understand the differences even after listening to the podcast like 3 times. The second one is how do we understand that within like an ecological approach, I guess? Like, for example, I do not understand chess from an ecological perspective. I don't. So, I'm having trouble. I'm not having trouble understanding 98% of how sports works from an ecological perspective. With affordances and recognizing how things kind of influence the way that you control your behavior. But I am having trouble with chess, because chess is like a much more, I don't know, it's just different. So like, how is it different? How would this using situational, like you said, you have a sense of being in the situation before. How does this differ from like a schema theory of motor learning, where you're building a more, I guess you could say, sophisticated schematic understanding, a representation of the game as you gain experience?
So it could be the terminology that just creates that little bit of void. So when you say prospective versus predictive control, I'm going to give you the question mark kick example again. Really simple. If I use predictive control, I'm going to try and block from a front kick, because I've identified that in a predictive manner, you're throwing a front kick. Whereas if I use, prospective control, I'm relying on online information. And that online information is the whip of your hip. So you started as a front kick, but you have to then with the hip turn to turn that into a question mark kick. If I've decided from a predictive perspective that I know what you're throwing after the first couple of milliseconds of your movement, I'm going to get kicked in the head. Whereas from a perspective, online perspective, from a perspective control side of things, I'm relying on not just the advanced cues, which may have made me think, yes, this might be a front kick, but also information that I'm getting online. So I'm not making a full out prediction. I'm allowing the information to unfold, and I'm interacting with the environment. So I'm able to identify, actually, no, this is no longer a front kick, and now I get to move. So that's the difference between the kind of predictive versus perspective. In terms of chess, it's a good question. How does so what's the exact question in relation to chess from that perspective?
I don't know what the exact question is. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out because when I have a friend who's good at chess. He's really into chess, and I'm trying to inject some. This is an exercise for me just as much as trying to give him an edge, because most people who train chess, I think they train from like a schematic or very information processing type of view of how to get better at chess. And maybe chess is just a different domain of skill, and it needs to be trained in a totally different way. But he pushes back on a lot of stuff from a more, what seems to be like an information processing type of standpoint. And I don't totally understand how you in a chess match, you would look at the chess pieces on the board and understand how to move from like an emergence type of point of view versus a schematic type of view, where you have a representation of the game, like a very sophisticated representation.
Yeah, so I think, have you ever seen the Queen's Gambit?
Yes, I have. It was great.
Okay, so some of my knowledge is going to come from the Queen's Gambit. Okay. So and again, I'm not huge on chess, but my understanding of chess is that there are particular strategies that people open with and they engage in throughout the game. Yeah. If you're going from that perspective or from that predictive control element of things, you're identifying that this is a strategy I'm going to use to win the game. But I think it's very rare that somebody begins with a strategy and it works out completely as they had identified in their head from a human perspective. The strategy always has to evolve and change or emerge based on the movements of the other player in that game.
Okay.
So from that perspective, yes, they think multiple steps ahead, but so is the other person from that elite level chess. So they're able to identify what's occurring in the game. And if they were to stick strictly to their initial schema perspective, the likelihood is you probably lose more frequently than you'd win because you're not adapting to what's happening from the other person.
Yeah.
Chess is very much an interaction game.
Yeah.
So if you're relying on this is the strategy I'm using, and unless you're playing a complete novice like me who has no idea what the strategies are, you're probably going to come up against the need to have to adapt to your opponent.
Okay. And so the pieces on the board where they're all positioned, kind of, if you're I'm not at this level, right? I'm a mega hobbyist in that I'm interested in it intellectually, and I maybe play it like once a month. But if you're at the situation where you can look at you're at the stage where you can look at a board, you can look at the pieces, you have almost like a barrier sense, like when you're walking in a crowd, you understand where everyone is, and you kind of just organize. Like my hypothesis for trying to understand this is that when you look at the board, you understand the board better than you have your level of practice where you understand the board. So you kind of actually know where all the pieces could move. And you understand that more intuitively and quicker than somebody who is still understanding where all the pieces can move and looking at the pieces individually and calculating manually in their head, the knight goes 2 steps over and one square down. You know what I mean? Like I still do that. I still have to calculate the movement, follow it with my eyes. Whereas somebody who's more practiced on the board can look at it and understand where the barriers are without the pieces being there. And maybe that goes into, maybe that goes into how they understand what's the potential pathways that somebody can go down from every position in chess.
Yeah. Well, let me throw another example at you that might help in that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
If I, who have very limited cooking experience, get the exact same ingredients as a Michelin star chef, and we're creating the exact same meal, he's probably going to do it a lot better than I did. We still have the same ingredients, but that person's in-depth knowledge of that particular thing, or their engagement with food and how they experiment with it, goes from this is a simple dish to this is now a more complex dish to somebody like Heston Bloomingdale who creates dishes that nobody's ever thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at it from that aspect, you're still working with the same ingredients, but people do very different things with those based on their engagement with those and what those particular ingredients afford the chef.
Yeah.
So I think it's just in terms of how you're able to view it has a big impact on how much you engage in it from that perspective.
So it's not just having the ingredients and a piece of paper with the recipe. It's the actual procedural experience of following the recipe, of the timing of how long it took to brown the meat, the color of the meat, the sound, everything that the information sources that you have while making it kind of feeds into your competence of making it. Like you can't just follow the recipe. There's more going on as you follow the recipe that informs your skill in making the dish, whatever it is that you're making. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm challenging myself to think of more dimensions because that was the biggest thing for me when I started getting into motor learning. I was like, yeah, this is the secret, dude. I'm going to read all these. I'm going to get better technique and all that stuff. And then I realized, it's not about better technique. It's about like perceptual training. It's about the psychological aspect of it, the sports psychology. There's all these other elements that are even more interesting and more, in some ways, more important to good training than a more efficient round kick, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the way I'm trying to challenge other people to go through that same, not the same, but like a similar arc of thinking that I've gone through, that it's actually a lot more than the selection of techniques and how to perform them better. It's also the timing, the reading, the distancing, the psychology level, the level of where you're tuning your attention and stuff like that. So yeah.
And that's a good point. And if there's ever a video that highlights that really well, Andre Agassi, the tennis player, there's a video of him talking about his ability to read serve, and he relied on the cue of the person's tongue and the direction their tongue pointed. So if their tongue pointed straight out, it was a serve straight down the line. If they went left, and this was just as they were bouncing the ball. Yeah. And he then went on an enigma style aspect of knowing when to use his knowledge of the tell and then when not to. So it's not just being able to identify it and then say you're going to use it, because that person may now completely change tack because they know you figured it out.
Yeah.
So he worked, and that video, I can send you that video afterwards, but it's a beautiful example of that attunement can be very different to what we typically view it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So, to wrap this up, because we covered a lot. Like, this is a lot of this is information dense. It's really excellent information. I think everything we've discussed is really going to be impactful to my listeners. Overall, how would you generally advise a combat sports coach to, if you had some principles, some really key principles to give them, how would you coach them to design their practices?
Yeah, context, relevance, and consequence. Take those three, and I think you're going to have much better practice transfer.
Awesome. That's like a neat little bow right there. Context, relevance, and consequence. Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. I love those. I think those really simple frameworks are so helpful and so useful for people that aren't not interested, but like aren't used to thinking about this on like a really complex academic level of how to approach practically making their practices better. So that's awesome. But thank you so much for coming on. This was an incredible conversation. I'm really pumped. It'll probably be, I'm on a monthly cadence now, so it'll probably be a couple months before it gets published, but I can't wait to put it out. Where can people find you if they want to follow your stuff or get in contact with you?
Yeah. People can find me on Twitter, I suppose. I am just at Alan Dunton, I think, is pretty simple. Or they can email me. I can give you my email if you want to put it in like the show notes or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I will for sure.
Yeah. So I'll give you my email, and people can shoot me an email, or they can send me a direct message on Twitter or any of the above. I'm not on any social medias other than Twitter. So other than that.
Yeah, that's where I found you was Twitter.
Yeah.
Actually, I found you on the Talent Equation, and I didn't recall you saying there was an email. So I was like, I'm going to try and find this guy on Twitter somewhere. And I found you.
Twitter
and you were responsive.
Twitter's easy. Yeah, I'm happy to engage. Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has any questions based on this, then absolutely give me a shout on Twitter or in an email, and we can just break things down from there.
Awesome. Well, I hope we can do this again sometime. I appreciate you coming on, and I will let you get back to your Monday.
Thanks so much for listening to the Combat Learning Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. It really helps us out. Finally, this episode, including the intro music, is produced by Micah Peacock. Thanks in advance, and I'll see you on the next episode.